On the morning of May 25th, 1979, a 6-year-old boy walked exactly 2 blocks. 2 blocks. The distance from his front door to his school bus stop in the heart of SoHo, Manhattan. He never arrived. He never came home. And for 33 years, his face would haunt a nation from the side of every milk carton in America. I'm about to take you through one of the most heartbreaking, infuriating, and ultimately redemptive criminal investigations in American history. A story of a child who disappeared in broad daylight, a family who refused to give up hope, and a monster who walked free for decades while an innocent man nearly paid for his crimes. But here's what they don't tell you in the headlines. Here's what nobody talks about. The answer was there all along. Someone knew. Someone always knew. And what kept that truth buried for over 3 decades will shake you to your core. If you have children, if you've ever been a child, if you believe that justice should be more than just a word, then you need to stay with me until the very end. And if this story moves you the way it moved me, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button. Share this video. Because Etan Patz's story is not just about one boy. It's about every child who ever walked to school, every parent who ever watched their kid disappear around a corner, and every monster who ever thought they could get away with murder. This story matters. You being here matters. Let's begin. New York City in 1979 was a different world. The city was gritty, dangerous, and pulsing with a kind of chaotic energy that seemed to seep from every subway grate and graffiti-covered wall. Crime rates were soaring. The South Bronx was burning. Times Square was a haven for prostitution and pornography. And yet, in the midst of all this urban decay, there existed pockets of bohemian optimism. Communities of artists, photographers, and young families who believed they could carve out something beautiful in the concrete jungle. SoHo was one of these places. The neighborhood, with its cast-iron buildings and cobblestone streets, had become a haven for creative types who converted old manufacturing lofts into sprawling live-work spaces. Among these urban pioneers were Stanley and Julie Patz. Stanley was a professional photographer, talented and respected in his field. Julie was a writer and editor who worked from home. Together, they were raising 3 children in their Prince Street loft, a space filled with art, books, and the kind of organized chaos that accompanies any household with young kids. Their middle child was Etan. He was small for his age, with sandy blonde hair that fell across his forehead and bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with an intensity unusual for a 6-year-old. He was curious, friendly, and eager to prove himself capable. Like many youngest children desperate to catch up to their older siblings, Etan wanted independence. He wanted to show his parents that he was a big kid now. For weeks, Etan had been begging his mother for permission to walk to the school bus stop by himself. It was just 2 blocks away, a straight shot down Prince Street to West Broadway. Other kids did it. His older brother did it. Why couldn't he? Julie Patz was hesitant. This was New York City, after all. But the neighborhood felt safe. Everyone knew everyone. Shopkeepers waved to passing children. There was a bodega on the corner, a familiar rhythm to the morning routine. And Etan was so earnest in his pleading, so desperate to prove his maturity. On the morning of May 25th, 1979, Julie Patz made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She said yes. It was a Friday, the day before Memorial Day weekend. The weather was pleasant, the streets were waking up to another spring morning, and Etan was practically vibrating with excitement. He put on his favorite outfit, a blue captain's hat, blue sneakers, and a t-shirt with a distinctive print. Julie helped him with his school bag, which contained $2. Etan was planning to buy a soda after school, a special treat to celebrate his first solo walk to the bus stop. At approximately 8:10 in the morning, Julie Patz stood at the fire escape window of their second-floor loft and watched her son walk down Prince Street. She saw his small figure move down the sidewalk, past the familiar storefronts, heading toward West Broadway. She watched until he turned the corner and disappeared from view. That was the last time Julie Patz saw her son. When Etan didn't come home from school that afternoon, Julie wasn't immediately alarmed. There was a block party planned at the school, and she assumed Etan had simply stayed late with friends. But as the hours ticked by and the afternoon stretched into evening, worry began to set in. She called the school. Etan had never arrived that morning. He had never gotten on the bus. He had never been marked present. In that moment, Julie Patz's world collapsed into itself. The 2 blocks between their loft and the bus stop suddenly stretched into an infinite chasm of possibility. What had happened in those 2 blocks? Where had her son gone? Who had taken him from the safety of his own neighborhood in the bright light of a spring morning? The New York City Police Department launched what would become one of the largest missing child investigations in American history. Over the following days and weeks, they would deploy hundreds of officers, canvass thousands of residents, and follow up on countless tips. Posters with Etan's photograph appeared on every surface in Manhattan. His face, captured in a portrait taken by his own father, became the symbol of every parent's worst nightmare. But in those crucial first hours and days, mistakes were made. Evidence was mishandled. Leads were not followed up with appropriate urgency. The investigation, despite its massive scale, was plagued by the kind of institutional failures that would only become apparent decades later. And somewhere in the chaos of the search, the truth about what happened to Etan Patz began its long journey into the shadows, where it would remain hidden for more than 30 years. The neighborhood searched. The city searched. The nation searched. And Etan Patz became the first missing child in American history to have his photograph printed on milk cartons, a campaign that would eventually reach millions of households across the country. His disappearance would lead to the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It would change the way America thought about child safety, stranger danger, and the vulnerability of our youngest citizens. But all of that came later. In those first desperate hours, there was only a mother's terror, a father's anguish, and an empty chair at the dinner table where a 6-year-old boy should have been sitting, telling his family about his adventure walking to the bus stop all by himself for the very first time. The search for Etan Patz consumed New York City with an intensity that the metropolis had rarely seen directed toward a single missing child. In a city where crime was rampant and resources were stretched thin, the disappearance of this small blonde boy from a Soho street corner somehow captured something essential about the collective fear of an era. Perhaps it was the ordinariness of it all. A child walking to school on a sunny morning. If this could happen here, in broad daylight, on a familiar street, then no child anywhere was truly safe. Within hours of Etan's disappearance, the NYPD had mobilized what would eventually become a force of over 100 detectives. They went door to door in Soho, questioning residents, shopkeepers, anyone who might have seen something that Friday morning. They searched rooftops and basements. They dug through dumpsters and crawled through sewers. They brought in dogs trained to detect human scent and followed trails that led nowhere. Stanley Patz used his skills as a photographer to create missing posters that were distributed throughout the city. The image he chose was one he had taken himself, a portrait of Etan looking directly at the camera with those striking blue eyes. It was an image that would become iconic, recognizable to millions of Americans who had never met the boy and never would. Stanley and Julie walked the streets themselves, pressing flyers into the hands of strangers, pleading for any information that might bring their son home. The media coverage was intense and relentless. Reporters camped outside the Patz family loft, documenting every development, every rumor, every theory. News crews followed the search parties as they combed through parks and empty lots. The story of Etan Patz became a national obsession, a focal point for anxieties about urban danger, child vulnerability, and the fragility of family life. Tips poured in from across the country. People reported seeing Etan in shopping malls, in other cities, in the company of suspicious strangers. Each tip was investigated, and each investigation led to disappointment. There were false confessions from mentally unstable individuals seeking attention. There were psychics who claimed to know where Etan was buried. There were theories involving organized crime, child trafficking rings, and satanic cults. The investigation became a labyrinth of dead ends and false hope. One name emerged early in the investigation, a name that would haunt the case for decades. Jose Antonio Ramos was a convicted child molester who had been in a relationship with a woman who occasionally worked as a babysitter for the Patz family. He was known to frequent the SoHo neighborhood. He matched the description of a suspicious man seen speaking with children near the bus stop on the morning of Etan's disappearance. Investigators interviewed Ramos multiple times over the years, and each time, he seemed to reveal a little more without ever quite confessing. In one particularly chilling interview, Ramos admitted to having been with a boy matching Etan's description on the afternoon of May 25, 1979. He claimed he had found the boy in a subway station, taken him to his apartment, and then released him unharmed. But his story changed with each telling, and he would never directly admit to harming Etan. He seemed to take pleasure in the cat-and-mouse game, in dangling pieces of information before investigators while always stopping short of giving them what they needed. For Stanley and Julie Patz, Ramos became the embodiment of their nightmare. They were convinced he had taken their son, and yet they could do nothing to prove it. The legal system, with its requirements for evidence beyond reasonable doubt, seemed designed to protect predators rather than victims. They watched as Ramos was imprisoned for other crimes against children, knowing in their hearts that he was responsible for Etan's disappearance, but unable to bring him to justice. The years passed, and the investigation entered a kind of suspended animation. The case remained officially open, and detectives continued to follow up on tips, but the sense of urgency faded. Etan's face aged on those milk cartons, computer-generated images showing what he might look like as a teenager, as a young adult, even though everyone knew, deep down, that he would never grow up. Stanley Patz continued to pay the phone bill for the same number they had when Etan disappeared, hoping that somehow, against all odds, his son might call. Julie Patz marked every anniversary of Etan's disappearance, keeping his memory alive while struggling with the impossible task of grieving for a child whose fate remained unknown. They kept Etan's room exactly as it had been on the morning he walked out the door, a shrine to hope and a monument to loss. The Patz family's tragedy had ripple effects that extended far beyond their SoHo loft. Their advocacy helped transform the way America responded to missing children. Before Etan, there was no coordinated national response to child abductions. Local police departments operated in isolation, and there was no central database of missing children. The Patz case exposed these failures and created pressure for change. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan proclaimed May 25th, the anniversary of Etan's disappearance, as National Missing Children's Day. The following year, Congress passed the Missing Children's Assistance Act, which led to the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The Milk Carton campaign, which had begun as a grassroots effort to find Etan, became a nationwide phenomenon, putting the faces of missing children in front of millions of American families. Etan Patz became more than a missing child. He became a symbol, a cautionary tale, a reason for parents to hold their children's hands a little tighter. His disappearance marked the end of an era of innocence, the moment when America realized that even the most ordinary activities, like walking to a bus stop on a sunny morning, carried unimaginable risks. But for Stanley and Julie Patz, the national attention was a double-edged sword. It kept Etan's case in the public consciousness, which they hoped might eventually lead to answers. But it also meant that their private grief was perpetually on display, that they could never truly escape the tragedy that had consumed their lives. They were trapped in a kind of purgatory, unable to move forward, unable to let go, waiting for a resolution that seemed like it might never come. And here's where I need to ask you something. Imagine you're a parent. Imagine you let your child walk those 2 blocks because you trusted your neighborhood, because you wanted to encourage independence, because you had no way of knowing what was waiting around that corner. Could you ever forgive yourself? Would the guilt consume you completely? Or would you channel that anguish into something larger, into a fight for justice that might protect other children? Think about that as we continue. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this question, this impossible question, is at the heart of what makes the Etan Patz story so devastating and so important. The investigation continued through the 1980s and into the 1990s. Detectives retired and new ones took over the case. Technology advanced, offering new possibilities for forensic analysis. But the essential mystery remained unsolved. What had happened to Etan Patz in those 2 blocks between his home and the bus stop? Where was his body? Who was responsible? Jose Antonio Ramos remained the primary suspect, even as the years turned into decades. In 2001, Etan was declared legally dead, a painful but necessary step that allowed his parents some measure of closure. In 2004, a civil court found Ramos liable for Etan's death in a wrongful death lawsuit brought by Stanley Patz. But Ramos, serving time for other crimes, had no assets, and the judgment was largely symbolic. It was justice in name only, a hollow victory that did nothing to bring Etan home or put his real killer behind bars. Or so everyone thought. For more than 3 decades, Jose Antonio Ramos cast a long shadow over the Etan Patz investigation. He was the boogeyman, the monster who had slipped through the cracks of justice. Every detective who worked the case, every prosecutor who reviewed the evidence, every journalist who wrote about Etan's disappearance eventually arrived at the same frustrating conclusion. Ramos probably did it, but there wasn't enough evidence to prove it in criminal court. Ramos seemed to enjoy his notoriety. In prison, where he served time for molesting other children, he reportedly kept a photograph of a young boy who resembled Etan. He gave cryptic interviews to journalists, alternating between hints of confession and flat denials. He was a predator who had learned to manipulate the system, using the very protections designed to ensure fair trials as shields against accountability. The Patz family lived with this knowledge, this terrible certainty that could not be proven. They watched as Ramos came up for parole again and again, and they testified against his release every single time. They became advocates for victims' rights, working to ensure that convicted child molesters could not easily return to the streets where they might claim more victims. But what nobody knew, what remained hidden in the shadows all those years, was that the real killer was not Jose Antonio Ramos. Let me take you back to May 25, 1979. While the police were organizing their search and the media was descending on SoHo, while Stanley and Julie Patz were frantically calling everyone they knew, a young man was going about his day just blocks from where Etan had vanished. His name was Pedro Hernandez, and he worked at a bodega on the corner of Prince Street and West Broadway, directly on Etan's route to the bus stop. Pedro Hernandez was 18 years old in 1979. He had moved to New York from New Jersey, looking for work, looking for a new start. He found a job at a small convenience store, a bodega like thousands of others scattered throughout the city. It was unremarkable work, stocking shelves, manning the register, helping customers. Nobody paid much attention to the quiet young man behind the counter. On the morning of May 25th, Pedro Hernandez was working at the bodega when Etan Patz walked past. Perhaps Etan stopped to look at the candy or the sodas. Perhaps Hernandez engaged him in conversation. Perhaps he offered the boy something, a treat, a cold drink, the $2 soda that Etan had been planning to buy after school. What happened next would remain locked inside Pedro Hernandez's mind for more than 30 years. He lured Etan into the basement of the bodega with the promise of a soda. There, in that dark space beneath the city streets, he choked the life out of a 6-year-old boy. Then he placed Etan's body in a plastic bag and left it with the garbage to be picked up by sanitation workers. The boy who had walked to the bus stop for the first time was disposed of like refuse, his remains lost forever in the vast machinery of New York City's waste management system. Pedro Hernandez never told anyone. Or rather, he told almost no one. In the immediate aftermath of the killing, consumed by guilt and fear, he confided in a few people. He told his then-girlfriend. He told family members. He told people at his church. But none of these people went to the police. None of them reported what they knew. For reasons that remain difficult to understand, they kept Pedro Hernandez's secret, and Etan Patz remained missing. Hernandez left New York shortly after Etan's disappearance. He moved to New Jersey, where he built a quiet life for himself. He got married. He had a daughter. He worked blue-collar jobs, never attracting attention, never giving anyone reason to suspect that he carried such a terrible secret. To his neighbors and co-workers, he was just another unremarkable man living an unremarkable life. But the guilt never left him. It manifested in strange ways. He became religious, joining a church, and confiding in religious leaders about his past. He reportedly prayed for forgiveness, tortured by what he had done. The weight of Etan Patz's death pressed down on him, invisible to the outside world but ever present in his own mind. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to focus on Jose Antonio Ramos. Every few years, there would be a new development, a new theory, a new reason to believe that Ramos was about to be charged. In 2001, investigators dug up the basement of a building where Ramos had once lived, searching for Etan's remains. They found nothing. The case seemed permanently stuck, a mystery that would never be solved. The shadows of this case stretched across decades. In those shadows, truth and lies intertwined. A guilty man walked free while investigators pursued the wrong suspect. Witnesses who might have come forward kept their silence. Evidence that might have solved the case decades earlier was lost to time. And all the while, Stanley and Julie Patz waited for answers that seemed like they would never come. The American justice system is built on the principle that it is better for a guilty person to go free than for an innocent person to be convicted. This principle, noble in its intent, creates space for monsters to hide. It allows people like Pedro Hernandez to build new lives on the buried bones of their victims. It permits decades of suffering for families like the Patzes, who know in their hearts that someone is responsible but cannot compel the system to act. In the shadows, guilt and innocence become relative terms. Jose Antonio Ramos was guilty of many things. He was a predator who had harmed multiple children. He was a manipulator who seemed to enjoy the pain he caused to Etan's family. But he was not, as it would eventually be revealed, the person who killed Etan Patz. He was a monster, but he was not that monster. Pedro Hernandez, on the other hand, appeared to be an ordinary man. He went to work. He raised a family. He attended church. From the outside, there was nothing to suggest that he was anything other than a regular, law-abiding citizen. But inside, he carried a darkness that had consumed a child's life and would eventually consume his own. The truth was there all along, hiding in plain sight. It was there in the whispered confessions to family members, in the prayers for forgiveness at church services, in the guilt that never quite faded no matter how many years passed. The truth was waiting for someone to find it, to bring it into the light, to finally give Etan Patz and his family the justice they deserved. And in 2012, after 33 years of waiting, that moment would finally arrive. In 2010, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office made a decision that would crack open the Etan Patz case after decades of stagnation. Cyrus Vance Jr., newly elected as district attorney, assigned a team of investigators to take a fresh look at the evidence. The case had become something of a holy grail for the NYPD, an unsolved mystery that haunted generations of detectives. Vance wanted to give it one more try. The new investigation began with a comprehensive review of everything that had been collected over 30 years. Every interview, every tip, every piece of evidence was re-examined with fresh eyes and modern forensic techniques. Investigators tracked down witnesses who had been children themselves in 1979, hoping that the passage of time might have loosened tongues or revealed new information. One thread of investigation led them to a man named Othniel Miller. Miller had worked as a handyman in the neighborhood around the time of Etan's disappearance, and he had access to the basement of a building just yards from the bus stop where Etan was supposed to have waited. In April 2012, investigators excavated that basement, searching for Etan's remains. The dig attracted intense media attention, cameras and reporters crowding the streets of SoHo as workers carefully removed concrete and soil. They found nothing. The excavation was another dead end, another disappointment in a case that seemed to produce nothing but disappointments. Stanley and Julie Patz watched from their loft, just doors away from the dig site, their hopes raised and then crushed once again. But the investigation wasn't over. While the basement dig was capturing headlines, a quieter line of inquiry was yielding more promising results. Investigators had been tracking down everyone who had worked in the vicinity of Etan's route on the morning of his disappearance. One of those people was a former bodega employee named Pedro Hernandez. The trail that led to Hernandez began with a tip from his brother-in-law. Years earlier, Hernandez had confided to family members about something terrible he had done in New York. These confessions had been kept secret within the family, but the brother-in-law, perhaps moved by guilt or by the renewed media attention on the case, finally came forward. He told investigators that Pedro Hernandez had admitted to killing Etan Patz. On May 23, 2012, 2 days before the 33rd anniversary of Etan's disappearance, NYPD detectives arrived at Pedro Hernandez's home in Maple Shade, New Jersey. What happened next would be the subject of intense legal debate for years to come, but the immediate result was clear. Pedro Hernandez confessed to killing Etan Patz. The confession was videotaped and lasted for hours. In it, Hernandez described how he had lured Etan into the basement of the bodega with the promise of a soda. He described how he had choked the boy until he stopped moving. He described how he had placed Etan's body in a plastic bag and left it with the garbage. He was calm, almost detached, as he recounted the details of the murder. "I choked him," Hernandez said in the videotaped confession. "I went to choke him. He was still and not moving. I wrapped him in a bag, a plastic bag, and I put him in the garbage." The confession stunned everyone who had worked on the case over the decades. Jose Antonio Ramos, the man who had been suspected for so long, was not the killer. The real perpetrator had been hiding in plain sight, living a quiet life in New Jersey while investigators pursued the wrong person. But confessions, no matter how detailed, are not automatically convictions. Pedro Hernandez's defense attorneys would soon argue that their client suffered from severe mental illness, including schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. They would claim that his confession was the product of a sick mind, a false memory created by psychological disturbance rather than an accurate account of what had happened. They would point to the lack of physical evidence, the absence of Etan's body, the decades that had passed since the alleged crime. The legal battle was just beginning, but for Stanley and Julie Patz, the confession represented something profound. After 33 years of not knowing, they finally had an answer. They finally knew what had happened to their son. They finally had a name and a face to attach to the monster who had taken Etan from them. The confession also raised troubling questions that would never be fully answered. Why had Hernandez's family kept his secret for so long? How many people had known, and why had none of them come forward? What responsibility did they bear for the decades of suffering that the Patz family had endured? These questions cut to the heart of something uncomfortable about human nature. We want to believe that if we knew something terrible, we would do the right thing. We would go to the police. We would speak up for the victim. We would not allow a child's killer to walk free for 30 years while his family shielded him from justice. But the reality is more complicated. Family loyalty, fear of consequences, denial, rationalization. All of these forces can keep people silent when they should speak. The people who knew Pedro Hernandez's secret were not necessarily evil. They were human, flawed, caught between the horror of what they knew and the impossible difficulty of turning in someone they loved. Etan Patz's case reveals something uncomfortable about all of us. It asks us to consider what we would do in an impossible situation. Would we speak up? Would we tell the truth, even if it meant destroying our own family? Or would we find ways to convince ourselves that it wasn't our responsibility, that someone else would eventually come forward, that the past was better left buried? The answer is not as simple as we might like to believe. And that complexity is part of what makes the Etan Patz story so haunting, even after the killer was finally identified. Pedro Hernandez was charged with second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping on May 24, 2012. He pleaded not guilty, and his defense team immediately began building a case around his mental illness. They argued that Hernandez suffered from severe psychiatric disorders that made his confession unreliable, the product of a disturbed mind rather than an accurate memory. The prosecution faced significant challenges. There was no body. There was no physical evidence linking Hernandez to the crime. 33 years had passed, and most of the potential witnesses from 1979 were either dead, elderly, or had memories too faded to be useful. The case would depend almost entirely on Hernandez's own confession and the testimony of family members to whom he had confided over the years. The first trial began in January 2015 and lasted for 3 months. The prosecution presented Hernandez's videotaped confession, along with testimony from his sister, his wife, and others to whom he had admitted the killing over the years. They painted a picture of a man who had lived with guilt for decades, unable to fully escape the horror of what he had done. The defense countered with psychiatric testimony arguing that Hernandez suffered from mental disorders that made him prone to false confessions and distorted memories. They pointed out inconsistencies in his various confessions over the years. They emphasized the complete lack of physical evidence. They raised the specter of Jose Antonio Ramos, suggesting that the real killer might still be the man who had been suspected for decades. Stanley and Julie Patz attended every day of the trial. They sat in the gallery, watching the man who had confessed to killing their son, listening to the arguments about whether his confession was true. For them, there was no doubt. After 33 years, they had finally found the person responsible for Etan's death. But the legal system required more than their certainty. It required proof beyond reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 18 days, an extraordinary length of time that suggested deep divisions among the jurors. In the end, they could not reach a unanimous verdict. The jury was deadlocked, with most jurors voting for conviction but one holdout refusing to find Hernandez guilty. A mistrial was declared. For the Patz family, the mistrial was devastating. They had come so close to justice, only to have it slip away at the last moment. They would have to endure another trial, another presentation of the evidence, another argument about whether Pedro Hernandez had really killed their son or whether his confession was the product of mental illness. The retrial began in October 2016. This time, the prosecution refined their approach, presenting the evidence more effectively and addressing the weaknesses that had troubled the first jury. They called additional witnesses who testified about Hernandez's confessions over the years. They presented expert testimony challenging the defense's psychiatric claims. The defense, for its part, continued to argue that Hernandez was mentally ill and that his confession was not reliable. They presented their own psychiatric experts who testified about his disorders. They continued to emphasize the lack of physical evidence and the decades that had passed since the alleged crime. Stanley Patz took the witness stand during the retrial. At 76 years old, he was called to testify about the morning his son disappeared. He described watching Etan walk down Prince Street, the last time he ever saw his boy. He described the years of searching, the decades of not knowing, the moment when he finally learned what had happened. His testimony was heartbreaking in its simplicity. A father who had lost his son, a man who had spent 37 years waiting for answers. His presence in the courtroom was a reminder that behind all the legal arguments and psychiatric debates, there was a real child who had died and a real family that had suffered. The jury in the retrial deliberated for 9 days. On February 14, 2017, they reached a verdict. Guilty. Pedro Hernandez was found guilty of murder and kidnapping in the death of Etan Patz. In the courtroom, Julie Patz wept. Stanley Patz sat in stunned silence. After nearly 4 decades, justice had finally been served. The man who had killed their son would spend the rest of his life in prison. Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life, the maximum sentence available under the law. He showed no emotion as the sentence was pronounced. The boy he had killed in 1979 would have been 44 years old. The man who killed him was now 65, facing the prospect of dying in prison. For the Patz family, the conviction brought a measure of closure that had seemed impossible for so long. They finally had an answer. They finally had justice. They finally had the acknowledgement from a jury of 12 citizens that their son had been murdered and that the person responsible would be held accountable. But closure is a complicated thing. No verdict could bring Etan back. No sentence could undo the decades of suffering. No justice could truly balance the scales of what had been lost on that May morning in 1979. The conviction of Pedro Hernandez brought a kind of resolution to the Etan Patz case, but it also raised questions that would never be fully answered. What had happened to Etan's remains? How had Hernandez lived with his guilt for so long? Why had the people who knew kept silent? And what did this case reveal about the American justice system, about the nature of evil, about the limits of closure? Etan's body was never found. Hernandez had placed him in the garbage, and the machinery of New York City's waste management had likely carried his remains to a landfill somewhere in the metropolitan area. There would be no burial, no gravestone, no final resting place for the Patz family to visit. Etan existed now only in memory, in photographs, in the legacy of the changes his disappearance had brought about. Jose Antonio Ramos, the man who had been suspected for so long, was released from prison in 2012, the same year Hernandez confessed. He had served the maximum sentence for his crimes against other children and was now a registered sex offender living in a halfway house. He would never be charged with Etan's murder, though many still believed he had been involved somehow. The truth was that Ramos was a predator, a monster in his own right. But he was not the person who had killed Etan Patz. The people who had known about Hernandez's guilt faced their own reckoning. His family members who had kept his secret for decades had to live with the knowledge that their silence had prolonged the Patz family's suffering. Some of them testified at the trial, finally breaking their silence after all those years. But the question of their moral responsibility remained unresolved. They had not killed Etan, but they had protected his killer. What did that make them? For Stanley and Julie Patz, the aftermath of the conviction was a time of complex emotions. There was relief that the case was finally closed. There was gratitude to the investigators and prosecutors who had never given up. There was a sense of vindication that their decades of advocacy had finally paid off. But there was also grief, fresh and raw, as the details of Etan's death were made public during the trial. Stanley Patz gave interviews after the conviction, speaking about what the resolution meant to him and his family. He spoke about the changes that Etan's disappearance had brought about, the laws and institutions that had been created to protect other children. He spoke about the importance of never giving up, even when the odds seemed impossible. "We finally know what happened," Stanley said. "We finally have answers. It doesn't bring Etan back, but it gives us some peace." Julie Patz, more private than her husband, stayed largely out of the public eye. But those who knew her spoke of her strength, her determination, her refusal to let her son be forgotten. She had spent nearly 4 decades fighting for justice, and now that fight was over. The Etan Patz case left a lasting legacy on American society. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, created in the wake of Etan's disappearance, has helped recover more than 300,000 missing children since its founding. The Milk Carton campaign, pioneered after Etan vanished, evolved into the Amber Alert system, which has become one of the most effective tools for finding abducted children. National Missing Children's Day, established on the anniversary of Etan's disappearance, continues to be observed every May 25th. It serves as a reminder of the children who are still missing and the families who are still waiting for answers. These changes are Etan's legacy, the good that came from an unimaginable tragedy. Because of what happened to him, countless other children have been found, countless other families have been reunited. Etan Patz, in death, helped save lives that would otherwise have been lost. But the legacy is also a reminder of what was lost. Every child who is found through the systems created after Etan's disappearance is a testament to his memory, but also a reminder of the boy who was never found, the child who became a symbol of every parent's worst nightmare. The Etan Patz case also revealed the limitations of the justice system. 38 years passed between Etan's murder and Hernandez's conviction. In that time, the wrong person was suspected, innocent people had their lives disrupted by the investigation, and the Patz family endured decades of uncertainty and pain. Justice was served, but it was delayed justice, incomplete justice, justice that could never fully heal the wounds that had been inflicted. And yet, for all its limitations, the system ultimately worked. A killer was identified and convicted. A family received answers. A case that had seemed unsolvable was finally solved. The arc of justice, to borrow a phrase, is long, but it bent toward accountability in the end. In the years following Pedro Hernandez's conviction, the case of Etan Patz continued to resonate through American culture. Documentary filmmakers told his story. Journalists wrote books about the investigation. The case became a touchstone for discussions about child safety, criminal justice, and the nature of evil. But for the people most directly affected by the case, the reckoning was more personal. Stanley and Julie Patz had devoted nearly 4 decades of their lives to finding out what happened to their son. Now that they knew, they faced a new challenge: how to live with that knowledge. The trial had revealed details that no parent should ever have to hear: the manner of Etan's death, the callousness with which his body had been disposed of, the decades during which his killer had lived a normal life while they suffered. These details were now part of their story, facts they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. And yet, there was also a kind of liberation in finally knowing the truth. The mystery that had consumed their lives was solved. The questions that had haunted them for decades were answered. They could finally grieve for their son without the added burden of uncertainty. Stanley Patz continued his advocacy work, speaking about the importance of child safety and the need for continued vigilance. He became a voice for other families of missing children, offering hope that even the coldest cases could eventually be solved. His message was one of perseverance. Never give up, never stop fighting, never let the world forget. Julie Patz, always more private, focused on her family and her personal healing. She had been pregnant with their youngest child when Etan disappeared, and she had raised that child in the shadow of the tragedy. Now, she could finally step out of that shadow, could finally allow herself to move forward. The broader community also underwent a reckoning. The people of SoHo, many of whom remembered the day Etan disappeared, reflected on how the tragedy had changed their neighborhood. The bohemian enclave of 1979 had transformed into one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Manhattan, but the memory of Etan Patz remained, a ghost that haunted the cobblestone streets. Law enforcement professionals studied the case for lessons about cold case investigations. What had gone wrong in those early days? How had the wrong suspect been pursued for so long? What could be done differently in future cases? The Etan Patz case became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale about the importance of keeping open minds and following all leads. The families who had kept Pedro Hernandez's secret faced their own reckoning. They had to live with the knowledge that their silence had consequences, that their choice to protect a family member had prolonged the suffering of another family. Some of them expressed remorse. Others remained silent. But all of them had to carry the weight of what they had known and what they had failed to do. Pedro Hernandez himself faced a reckoning of a different sort. In prison, he would have decades to contemplate what he had done. Whether he felt genuine remorse, whether he understood the magnitude of his crime, whether he would ever truly accept responsibility, these questions remained unanswered. His psychiatric disorders, real or exaggerated, created a barrier between him and full accountability. But the legal system had spoken. 12 jurors had found him guilty beyond reasonable doubt. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying for the crime he had committed on a May morning in 1979. Justice, delayed though it was, had been served. The reckoning extended to society as a whole. The Etan Patz case forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about child safety, about the prevalence of predators, about the vulnerability of the youngest members of society. It shattered the illusion that children were safe in their own neighborhoods, walking the same streets they walked every day. This reckoning led to lasting changes. Parents became more vigilant. Schools implemented new safety procedures. Communities organized to protect their children. The innocence that had characterized childhood in earlier eras was replaced by a new awareness of danger, a new caution that persists to this day. Some would argue that this increased vigilance has gone too far, that children today are overprotected, that the fear generated by cases like Etan's has restricted childhood freedom unnecessarily. These debates continue, with no clear resolution. But what is clear is that Etan Patz's case changed the way America thinks about child safety, permanently and profoundly. On a spring morning in SoHo, the sun falls on the same cobblestones that Etan Patz walked across on May 25, 1979. The neighborhood has changed beyond recognition. The gritty bohemian enclave has become a haven for luxury boutiques and expensive restaurants. The artists and young families who once gave the neighborhood its character have long since been priced out. But if you look closely, you can still find traces of the past. The building where the Patz family lived still stands on Prince Street. The corner where the bus stop once was is now occupied by different businesses, but the geography remains the same. 2 blocks. That's all it was. If you've made it this far, you understand why this story matters. You understand why Etan Patz's name deserves to be remembered. You understand why the fight for justice, no matter how long it takes, is always worth pursuing. So share this story. Tell others about Etan Patz. Subscribe to this channel so that more stories like this can be told. Because every child deserves to be remembered. Every victim deserves justice. And every family deserves the truth, no matter how long it takes to find it. Etan Patz was 6 years old when he walked out his door for the first time by himself. He was curious, brave, and eager to prove that he was a big kid. He never got the chance to grow up, to discover who he might have become, to live the life that was stolen from him. But in the end, his story is not just about loss. It's about the parents who never stopped searching. It's about the investigators who never closed the file. It's about a nation that learned from tragedy and built something better. It's about justice delayed but not denied. Etan Patz matters. He mattered in 1979, and he matters today. Remember his name. Remember his story. And remember that even in the darkest cases, truth has a way of finding its way to the light.